There's a magnanimity, a largeness of soul, a largeness of spirit, but also just a largesse about him of generosity and largeness. Okay, he's just a big guy, 300 some pounds, rather rotund. He'd be in his dressed up, and then be in his cape when he's out walking, in his hat and his umbrella, or which become his sword for swashbuckling, and quite a figure as he would go for strolls.
Welcome to Matters of Soul Importance, where we dive deeply into topics of both earthly and eternal consequence. I'm Roxanne Solonen, faith columnist and features writer for the Forum, author, and speaker. In this episode, I ask Mike Hagstrom, who was G.K. Chesterton? Early on in this podcast's planning, I was intent on having it be named In Polite Company, based on Chesterton once having taken issue with the old adage, never discuss politics or religion in polite company, by saying instead, in a British accent of course, I never discuss anything else except politics and religion. There is nothing else to discuss. Brilliant as I thought that title was, I soon discovered someone else had beat me to it. But even as I moved on to other ideas, I was determined to keep the spirit of Chesterton as a part of this endeavor. As a fellow journalist, Chesterton once thought the Christian faith was hogwash, but eventually he thought his way back into the heart of the church and Christ. In having discovered the truth of the faith, he had a proclivity to not bypass the hard things for the sake of living in reality and truth, an inclination I greatly admire. Wanting someone to help me unravel this phenomenal character, I turned to Mike Hagstrom, longtime member of a local Chesterton Society, which exists to keep the spirit of Chesterton and the gifts he brought our world alive. Mike taught religion at Shanley High School here in Fargo for 31 years, along with having served in various leadership capacities. He now leads the John Paul II Catholic Schools Network as president. Mike is married to Sean. They have 2 grown children, Therese and Joseph, and 2 grandsons, James and Oliver. Perhaps as much as anything else, Mike has a flair for wit and wry humor, not unlike our muse today. Now let's see what he can unearth about the man once dubbed the Prince of Paradox. Well, Mike, welcome today to Matters of Soul Importance. I'm so happy to have you here.
Thank you, Roxanne. It's a delight to be here. Thank you for the invitation.
Absolutely. Well, I've really been looking forward to this interview because I kind of had at the beginning when we were discussing the titles for this podcast, I kind of had a sentiment as I got deeper into my career and maybe a little bit bolder and read a little bit more and felt more comfortable in sharing about my faith. I on my own accord realized that these topics of religion and politics are no-nos for a lot of situations, but at the same time, my soul stirred to talk about them. And I didn't start out talking about them. I started talking about things that were a little less controversial. But at the end of the day, they are the things I find that matter in terms of especially religion. Because, well, as a person of faith, that's it. That's our whole story is driven by that. So when I came across Chesterton's quote about, actually, the quote was him turning a certain utterance on its head, which is never discuss religion and politics in polite company. And he turned it around. And so he said, those are the only subjects to talk about. And I was just like, yes, this is my guy, you know? And so when we were trying to name this podcast initially, one of the ideas I had was in polite company. But someone beat me to that. So I had to revise things. But he's kind of my patron saint, I would say. And I know he's not canonized yet, but I think there's some people would hope that to be happening. So tell me a little bit about him and about how you came across Chesterton? Because I know you've been involved in a local chapter of a group that kind of is named for him. So we can talk about that too. But do you remember when you first came across him and how?
Sure. And I could back up just to say that I think, in introducing more about Chesterton, it'll shed light on precisely what you're talking about, the quotation. And Chesterton has a tendency to take a quotation or some proverb and help us see it in a new light and see things in a new way that we've never seen before. So that's a genius and a gift of his. He is known for his quotations, his quips, his proverbs. And most people are probably introduced to Chesterton through those things. I don't recall ever reading Chesterton in junior high or high school. In college, I think there was some exposure, but along the way, I just became so familiar with him, increasingly familiar. And I would say that I'm a true amateur in the sense, literally, I love, like amateur literally means a lover. I love Chesterton and his insights, his wisdom, and what he can still teach us today. There's so much there. So just have always relished and delighted. I would say, too, that with your title or with your topic of religion and politics, Chesterton relished reality above all. And he's not going to flee from any topic. He would draw his sword and go in. But his spirit, seeking the truth of things, seeking clarity, seeking to explain clearly and cogently, that was just such a great gift of his. He would describe himself, above all, as a journalist.
Yes.
And we're here.
Yeah.
And we can mention the Fargo Forum, and there's a statue as you walk in the door. There's a young boy with a newspaper, and it says truth on the top. So Chesterton, again, relished reality, seeking the truth, had no issue or problem entering into controversy and having dialogue. I think what our age can gain from him is how he conducted that. Without the ad hominem attacks and dismissive of arguments, but really truly arguing, engaging, listening, and discussing, and then such a profound grasp of reality and the nature of things, and a very much a common sense approach. So I think there's so much we can gain from that spirit of conversation, and especially in our time.
Yeah. He's an Englishman, so he comes from England, and I think if I understand correctly, he was someone who C.S. Lewis was under his tutelage, or they came around the same time, right? But one influenced the other. Do you recall which it was? I thought I read recently that C.S. Lewis was influenced by G.K. Chesterton. So.
I'm an Anglophile, and I've always loved England and all things English. I'm an English major in college. I think it was, kind of the Walt Disney Sunday night TV shows with Mary Poppins and other English themes, and I just love the English accent, etc. Yeah. And then loved English literature and reading all the way through. So he's born May 29th, 1874. That's 150 years coming up this May 29th. I think it'd be great to offer a toast in honor of Chesterton, maybe read some Chesterton, whoever you are, on that day, May 29th. Born, again, 1874, 150 years ago. So, he precedes C.S. Lewis, Tolkien, and others, but he had a great impact and influence. And C.S. Lewis, after reading The Everlasting Man by Chesterton, really found it easier to embrace Christianity. So one of the greatest apologists, you could say, a Christian apologist of the 20th century, C.S. Lewis, renowned, again, greatly influenced by Chesterton. I know he influenced Tolkien as well. I don't know that they ever gathered or met.
Okay.
They were alive at the same time, but very, very influential on many, many people. I mentioned he's a journalist, wrote profusely, prodigiously, just daily habit. But then in addition to his essays and his newspaper columns, by the way, in 1908, there is a collection published of newspaper columns. You talk about, his influence. He named that in 1908, All Things Considered. And there's the public radio show still called All Things Considered. Started in 1971, but that title, All Things Considered, Chesterton's, I remember local public radio appeal for funds, fundraising, and talking, what a genius title that was, what a great title for a show, All Things Considered. And I just had to call and say, by the way, All Things Considered, G.K. Chesterton, 1908. So, yep, it's a great title and a great name. But poetry, detective stories, Father Brown detective stories, and you've maybe seen the PBS, speaking of, PBS series on Father Brown, the BBC series, Father Brown, biographies, you name it, any literary form. He was just a genius. And so thousands and thousands of pages.
I'm kind of surprised, given that he isn't more well known. Like, most people don't know about G.K. Chesterton.
And probably known through these little quotations or sayings that, I've heard that before, or that was very influential. Gandhi was influenced by his line, I think it's in Orthodoxy, the Christian ideal has not been tried and found wanting. It hasn't been tried.
Yeah.
And so Gandhi embraced that. Well, what if somebody really practiced what Jesus taught?
Right.
And Chesterton influenced Gandhi.
Okay, and then also getting back to that point of truth, which that's something that's important to me too. And I know I've heard that the transcendentals, which we talked about earlier with Father Meyer, when he talked about Can Beauty Save the World, those three are the poles that draw people to the faith. And for me, all of them do, but truth was an important one for me, kind of coming back more fervently to my faith after I kind of wandered away or just wasn't sure in my college years. And so that's another point, but he was not someone of faith at some point. And just like C.S. Lewis, he had to come to it through logic. I mean, and obviously there were other poles too. Something was missing, and he had to go in search of what that was. So I think that makes that truth aspect, why that's so important to him, because for a while he lost sight of it and didn't have a grasp of it, or had not grappled with it enough in his mind to realize, to make that leap of faith.
As a teen, as sometimes happens with teenagers, he, exploring various things, he and his brother Cecil really became involved in the occult, and he was at the depths of the abyss of face-to-face with evil. And, he was able to turn away from that and gradually, eventually, returned to, in some ways, his childhood instincts. He grew up in a home very warm, filled with wonder, gratitude, joy, awe, appreciation. His father would recite Shakespeare, and in Chesterton, at a young age, Chesterton could quote Shakespeare. His father had loved fairy tales and had a pantomime castle with characters and brought the world to life. That's Chesterton's earliest memory of his father doing these little enacting stories. And so the value of the story, of mystery, of awe and gratitude, wonder, he returned to that.
Yes.
And then in the early 1900s, he writes a book. He's critical of people he identified, skeptics, as heretics. So he wrote a book, controversialist, on heresy and contemporary heretics. Well, who are you to write about heretics when you don't have, what is your belief? And so that led him to write Orthodoxy a few years later. Gradually, in 1922, 22 years after Hilaire Belloc, fellow author, invited him to Christmas Eve Mass in 1900. So he attends Christmas Eve Mass, 1900. 22 years later, he enters the Catholic Church and dies with the last sacraments in June of 1936. So there's a gradual growing embrace of Christian faith and then eventually Catholicism.
I read something just like this morning about the occult, like how he had dipped into there. And I thought, that's another thing we're kind of, and then I heard another podcast this morning, just the end of it, that was talking about how that's making a comeback, the occult. And so, it's maybe time to bring back old G.K. Chesterton to light the path. And
his, disciple will say, or the one he influenced, C.S. Lewis, who said there are two equal and opposite errors we can have about the devil. One is to take him too seriously. The other is to take him too lightly. So Chesterton recognized the reality of evil. And as Lewis said,
you have to experience it sometimes to truly believe it and to articulate it. And he did. And that makes the light all the more beautiful to draw toward. And I remember reading about his vision of life as a story, as this, the curtains open, and I don't even remember, but I just thought, I liked the theater too growing up, and it's to think of it that way, and to not have that story it makes all the difference when we're not seeing ourselves in a story. We talked with Nancy Gord recently about stories and how important they are, and everyone has a story, but we are inside a story. We're inside the trajectory towards heaven, and so I just love how he kind of brought that to my mind because I'm such a visual person. Yeah. So one thing I wanted, speaking of visual, go ahead.
Well, I'll have to look for a footnote, but there's a quotation, you speak of the influential quotations that really struck me of his in that regard, that, two things ultimately remain a mystery, a person and a story's always about a person. So you can't reduce. You were married long time, Roxanne, to our spouses, and every day there may be a surprise or something new or unexpected. A person always remains a mystery. We want to categorize them and define them and label them and dissect them. But part of what's wrong with journalism in some ways and the approach to education today. But keeping mystery alive.
Yeah.
And because it's that dignity of the person, the unrepeatable, utter uniqueness of each and every person.
Right.
And a story is always about a person. He's right.
And to some degree, we're even a mystery to ourselves. Only God truly knows us through and through, which is kind of an odd thing to think about. But of course, and so we actually discover ourselves too, as well as other people discovering us. Speaking of visuals, though, I do want to paint a little bit of a visual of this character because he was no GQ man, he definitely was a caricature of himself. So do you want to give us a little bit of a visual glimpse of what this guy, how he appeared? Not, I know that he was known, he was brilliant, and at the same time, I heard he was always late, always disorganized. I can just imagine things falling, papers going all over the place, and people trying to keep track of him. But yet, there he was. He came through. But yeah, how would you describe him?
Well, today he would text his wife, Frances, but back then he wired her. Am in Harborough Market. Where ought I to be?
Yes. Yeah.
She kept him on track and coordinated his schedule as best she could. But yes, he would be fascinated, distracted by things, perhaps. But that captures him very, very well. There's a magnanimity, a largeness of soul, a largeness of spirit, but also just a largesse about him of generosity and largeness.
Yeah.
Okay, he's just a big guy, 300 some pounds, rather rotund. He'd be in his dressed up and then be in his cape when he's out walking, in his hat and his umbrella, or which become his sword for swashbuckling, and quite a figure as he would go for strolls, go for his walks. Talk about controversy. George Bernard Shaw, on the opposite of many religious and political perspectives from Chesterton, but here's a model for today how they could parry and thrust and counter and debate on an issue, but still remain friends and keep that friendly spirit. So Shaw came up, poked Chesterton in the stomach and said, "What are you going to name it?" Again, very large, overflowing belly. What are you going to name it?
Right. Kind of offensive.
Kind of offensive. And Chesterton replies, "Well, if it's a girl, I shall name it Elizabeth. If it's a boy, I shall name it Gilbert Keith. And if it's wind, I shall name it Bernard Shaw." So he even, being poked fun at of his rotund girth, his roundness, he even turns that into a little.
But to come up with those things, I'm not that quick. Yeah, it takes me a while.
What a wit! What a wit! Angels can fly, he said, because they take themselves so lightly. Well, how ironic. St. Thomas Aquinas, who we wrote a fantastic book upon, likewise a very large man, we call him the angelic doctor. So these very large, heavy-boned, meaty, fleshy people, and angelic in their approach to life. Angels can fly because they take themselves so lightly.
Beautiful. I just, getting off track here, but I just couldn't help when you just said that quote. I was thinking about W.C. Fields, and if I remember this right, someone had approached him and he was inebriated and was like, they said, "Oh, you're sure drunk." And he's like, "That is true, but in the morning I shall not be drunk and you will still be ugly. So, like, maybe that's a little mean, but those are the kind of things like, you got to laugh at yourself and others, especially if you have those arrows flying at you. We got to find a way to deal with this life. It is not always easy, right? And he did. He kind of dealt with the heaviness and the lightness at the same time, and also just the kind of earthy, talking about, cigars and beer and whatever. He liked food. He probably had to confess the sin of gluttony a lot. I don't know.
I like the ink of inkiness. I mean, he loved it, delighted, relished in reality, as I said. He delighted in things. And yes, food and cigars and he loved the world and appreciated it, had this great gratitude for all that existed.
And I think that's sometimes something people misperceive about Christians, since we're heaven directed, that we should not be bound and delight in the world. But I think he had a nice balance there. And no, this world is good, and we're not inclined to want to leave it. I mean, life is something to cling to. So
he wrote this as a young man. You say grace before meals. All right. But I say grace before the play and the opera, and grace before the concert and the pantomime, and grace before I open a book, and grace before sketching, painting, swimming, fencing, boxing, walking, playing, dancing, and grace before I dip the pen in the ink. All is grace. All creation is to be appreciated and to be
definitely
enjoyed.
Beautiful. Thank you so much for that. I want to read, it's a little bit different than the organization you belong to locally, but there's a Society of G.K. Chesterton, and they have a little summation of him. Well, this says that he cannot be summed up in one sentence nor in one paragraph. In fact, in spite of the fine biographies that have been written of him, he has never been captured between the covers of one book, but rather than waiting to separate the goats from the sheep, let's just come right out and say it. G.K. Chesterton was the best writer of the 20th century. Now, that might be arguable, but this is what this person is saying on the website. He said something about everything, and he said it better than everyone else. Anybody else. But he was no mere wordsmith. He was very good at expressing himself, but more importantly, he had something very good to express. The reason he was the greatest writer of the 20th century was because he was also the greatest thinker of the 20th century. Again, that can be argued, perhaps, saying he's the greatest thinker of the 20th century, and yet so few people in our world today, I think, even know of him. So I'm happy to kind of bring G.K. Chesterton back here today and give him a little bit of a chance to speak his mind. So one of the things I thought, since his quotes are so pungent, and I thought you've already called up some of them, and I'm so grateful for that. I found some online, too, that I thought would be kind of fun to throw out there, and you might have some also that you want to get in here. But because I think through these quotes, even without having the context, there's something to learn and discuss. So I'm just going to go down through some of these, and we can just kind of share our thoughts. We thank people. Actually, it's really in line with what you just said. We thank people for birthday presents of cigars and slippers. Can I thank no one for the birthday present of birth? Now, I'm gonna add something to that. In 2016, I wrote a column about gratitude that kind of went crazy, because how the whole thing started is I was in Canada with a friend we were speaking there, and I was just so, I didn't even realize partway through our stay, we were staying with a friend of mine, and I didn't even realize that she had given up her and her husband's bedroom for me, and her husband and they have a Down syndrome son. We're crunched into this other little room. And we came in, we'd kind of had a crazy flight. My friend was in the basement with her. She had a little girl, and so she had the whole basement. And I had this lovely room, and I was delighted. And I thought, oh, they left me a bottle of water. There's some flowers here. I have my own bathroom. I didn't even realize what they had done. And I was just so moved. And of course, they were the ones, but I remember getting ready for our talk that night, and I was in the bathroom, and I just felt this joy and just this love of God for me. And so I wrote a column about that, about feeling grateful for God and for his charity and kindness and mercy and provisions and just the little things. And I just asked the question, what do atheists, like, who do they thank? Now, in that, I wasn't saying that I don't think atheists can thank anyone, because of course they can, but it was misunderstood and it kind of ended up going viral and it almost made me give up the pen. But your wife and her sister were two that actually encouraged me to keep going, and I'm forever grateful for that. But it's kind of that, I guess that's what I kind of hear. Maybe I'm misunderstanding him, but he's saying we can thank people for, these other things, cigars and slippers. What about the birthday present of birth? What do you think about that quote? Am I reading it right, or am I?
I believe so. To whom do I give thanks? Is there someone or some person to give thanks to? Are things random, chaotic, mere chance? And that's certainly an option, and in which case I can choose of my own to have a grateful attitude in spite of that, spite of all things. Or is there someone who is, we'll say, a creator or the provider or the one to whom we owe all things, okay, every breath, the fact that anything exists. And for Chesterton, it became relatively easy to give thanks. Eric Clapton says, I'm not a religious person, but I've always found it easy to say thank you just for all that is. Just that sense of gratitude that for some people perhaps comes naturally, but Chesterton's, well, what is the source of that? I think C.S. Lewis, in one of his arguments for God, said we have this desire to give thanks, but is a desire created not to be fulfilled? All desires are meant to be satisfied ultimately. There's a good or a goal. And what is that ultimate good? What is that ultimate goal?
Yeah, and I was thinking too, within this little quote, it's just a sentence long or two, I think also inherent is the question of what is goodness and where does it come from? Are we just good? I mean, where is that? And I think those of faith would say that's our God is good, and that's why goodness is here, because the Creator had to be good in order for there to be good. Otherwise, the world would just be chaotic, not have any order. But anyway, that goes into a deeper level. But I just wanted to kind of revisit that whole thing because, and here's the other thing. I truly was grateful to these people. I mean, beautiful people. And I was able to thank them and celebrate that. But when I was alone in the bathroom, curling my hair or whatever, thinking about God being so kind to me, it was the breadth of all that he's done for me and my awe that he continues to keep loving me through people that, through others. And so I guess in that I felt like my joy and gratitude was expanded beyond any person. It was like acknowledging this being that had followed me from the very beginning. And that's where I feel like there's even more joy in that it's bigger joy. And it's not that you can't also thank people, but like, again, what's the source of that? And that source is eternal and has been with you before you even existed, So anyway, there's a lot there, and I never got to come back to all that, but through Chesterton, I can kind of revisit that moment and clarify what I meant.
Well, I'm willing to be schooled and to learn more, but I think etymologically in English, the name for God is related to goodness is a derivative of that. You think of the medieval, God spell, okay, which is a medieval English term for gospel, good news. When you say goodbye to somebody, that's a contraction. You're saying God be with ye. Okay. So the goodness is and God are, God is the ultimate good. You talk about the transcendentals with, Father Meyer on a previous podcast. Mm-hmm. God is the ultimate good. And, the words in English are closely related.
Yeah. There's just something when we discover that just brings such joy.
St. Francis of Assisi, whom Chesterton wrote a book about as well, St. Thomas Aquinas, famously said, greatly should the love be loved of him who loved us so greatly. Just where is my love directed? Where is my response directed? Where is my gratitude directed? Greatly should the love be loved of him who loved us so greatly.
Yeah. Well, along the same lines, the next one is I had always felt life first as a story, and if there's a story, there's a storyteller. And, I knew that too, but when I read that, I remember reading that line from him, I'm like, yes, it's so obvious. Like if there's creation, there has to be a creator, and it has to be something that is outside of creation, right? I mean, you can't have creation without a creator. It seems so simple, but I understand that it's not always simple for the individual soul who must grapple with this, and that there's, some of us are given more grace. I don't understand that. Some of us have, growing up, like Chesterton had this really lovely childhood, and maybe someone else doesn't have that. And so it might be harder to see the good, So I understand it's complex. I don't want to, minimize the difficulty of the grasping towards God, but there is a point where you do have to kind of bring logic into it and then maybe go from there. So, and this is just showing a little bit of his personality. We should thank God for the beer and Burgundy by not drinking too much of them. He's taking the gratitude thing there and saying, well, there's a little bit of balance here.
It's part of Chesterton's, we haven't used the P word yet, but paradoxical proverbs, and he's known as the master of paradox. And I think in many ways, again, as he relished reality is somewhat of a paradox. The infinite God, for Christians believe, became a helpless, innocent child and a babe in Bethlehem. So the creator of the universe is born a baby, and just that paradox at the heart of the incarnation might be what is in the background of Chesterton's famous use of paradox. He also loves us to think outside the box and say things in new ways and take standard things and give us new insight and shine new light upon them.
And communicates that so well. He just had such a gift for communicating that, because it's one thing to think certain things, but to be able to say it in the way that he did is just amazing. Here's another one. I think this is really good because it shows that, well, I'll just read it. The whole modern world has divided itself into conservatives and progressives. The business of progressives is to go on making mistakes. The business of conservatives is to prevent mistakes from being corrected. I like that because I think it would be really easy to put him in a box then, and kind of say, well, he's on this side or that side. But what he's saying, what do you think he's saying there, Mike?
Well, I would agree, and how refreshing that type of approach would be. We draw the lines, and we've got our enemies, and we've got my team, and I'm going to, sometimes it gets quite tiresome, honestly, reading the paper. I read the daily paper every day of my life and various ones, but I can almost write people's columns in advance. I know what they're going to say, but what if we didn't have just had a different approach, seeing the merits of others, and again the ad hominem attacks of people, and it gets nauseating after a while. Can we discuss and debate the ideas and the reality the person is attempting to describe or capture, the principle, the point they're trying to make? How refreshing that would be. It's just a good reminder for all of us to be able to engage in dialogue and debate and not cancel or dismiss or, And
we all fall into it. Every sector falls in, and it's a trap, it is a trap, especially as people of faith. We are called to a higher standard, and we are sinners also, and we fall short of that. But if we could learn some of these things, to me, it's all about taking the emotion out. If we can do, because all of this, I think, is really about emotion. When we don't hear each other, it's all coming from our wounds or whatever, and they're just kind of spilling out. But if we kind of just calm down and think through things and have logic about them, we can actually, I think that's where charity is. It's because charity, love, is the willing. It's not thinking or it's not feeling the good of the other. It's willing. We have to make a conscious decision to see people as, like you said earlier, unique, unrepeatable. Like they're never going to come by again. This person that you're in front of, this is a unique person and rare. And if we could see people that way, we could learn a lot from each other, I think.
Yep, respecting the individual uniqueness and dignity of each person, and not the kind of romantic. In Brothers Karamazov recall, and Dorothy Day would often quote this, that love in action is always harder than love in dreams. That specific person who bothers me or annoys me or who is inconvenient for me as I'm passing by, the Samaritan passing by the wounded person on the road. But love in action is what we are called to, the specific person. Chesterton may shock some who, if you put labels on for some of his views on economics and on capitalism, on his love for and defense for the poor, and so he didn't fit labels. Labels didn't fit him very well. He was eager to explore these issues and seek the truth of things.
So he had some enemies on either side, perhaps, but also some fans.
Yes.
Yeah. Here is another one. If there were no God, there would be no atheists. That's one to think about a little bit. It's pretty simple, but the atheist is, I guess, someone resisting or, I don't know, saying there is no God.
Look at the etymology, atheist, with literally without God. Well, if there's no God, then there's nothing to protest. So, that's what his, in a way, saying ironically, again, a kind of a paradox. Yep.
And again,
there's that level, but then there's also if he is the creator, indeed, this one exists as well. So there's a kind of a dual meaning to that one.
Mm-hmm. And that fight and that resistance is worthy. That's it. We all have to fight that and try to come to that in our own understanding through our own journey.
In defense, would say, "Well, I'm protesting your illusion, of which is God, or your unreality, your dream world, which is God." So, but
I guess my question is, I'll leave that one there. But I thought it was an interesting, just a short little quip. But well, I like this one too. Don't be so open-minded that your brains fall out. Sometimes he just we can be too open-minded. I think, again, it's this balance of, yes, be open to things, listen to other people's perspectives. But there is a point where we have to, I kind of think of that too as like, there's people that kind of sit on the fence and don't want to have an opinion, don't want to take a stand you're so open-minded that, you just go along with everything. But actually, there is a point where Jesus said, no more. Like, I'm going to draw this line here, and there's truth, and it has to be abided by. So.
And maybe it's somewhat the agnostic position. There's not enough evidence. I'm not sure. I think Chesterton said, you can be so open-minded. It's almost like an open mouth. Eventually, you've got to bite down on something, to be fed, to be nourished. So, what can I close my mouth on? What can I, my mind is open, I'll explore things, but eventually what would I grasp as the truth?
I think people are scared now because it's such a hostile environment. And so a lot of people are fearful of biting down. What would you say, in the spirit of G.K. Chesterton perhaps, or Mike Hagstrom, to encourage people to bite down?
Part of biting down, part of making a commitment, part of making a decision is that there are consequences. If I decide there is a God or this faith, etc., then I'm called to live a certain way, and maybe I don't want to give up. I'm comfortable right now, seemingly or apparently comfortable. I am seemingly on the surface satisfied. Chesterton may ask, are you truly satisfied? The deepest desires of your heart, are they being met, or is it mere creature comfort? What ultimately satisfies? Chesterton would argue that's God.
Mm-hmm. I remember a time in young adulthood where I was drawing more fervently into the church, but there was something holding me back, and I felt like I was bouncing back and forth. I wasn't all in. I was scared, and I think a lot of people are in that place. And at some point, you realize that jumping in is way worth whatever you're hanging on to that is behind you.
Here, Chesterton can help too. If a thing is worth doing, it's worth doing badly. And I remember many people react rather rather strongly to that quotation. I've used that before in, faculty meetings and staff meetings. And what do you mean doing badly? We're about excellence here. That's our core value. And well, that's not what Chesterton means. He, of course, wants you to do your best. But at some point, you've got to decide just to do something. If God has made the world good and things in it are good, and you do it because it's worth doing, even if it's done badly. Otherwise, you'll be on the fence. You'll never decide to propose or to get married or to embrace a faith. You'll be a sideline spectator.
Kind of reminds me, during Lent, we some of us were following the Father Walter Chiswick, who wrote "He Leadeth Me," which is a book I've read several times and was really moved by. But he had to make a decision. He was in the Russian Gulag. He was had been named a spy in World War II in Russia, and at one point, he had to make a decision to tell the truth. And once he did that, he just describes the freedom, even though he knew he could die. And he just realized that at that point, he had almost lost his faith. And so he went through this excruciating process. And then once it was freedom. Like, he didn't even care. He's like, he told the truth and knew that he could be led to the executioner because of that minute. And he felt so free because he knew he was telling the truth. And here's G.K. Chesterton. The true soldier fights not because he hates what is in front of him, but because he loves what is behind him. That's another kind of the paradox again, that it's not that we're fighting something that we hate. It's that we see something better over here, and we're willing, like Father Chiswick did, to do the true and honest thing, even if it means dying. I mean, and we have Jesus on the cross showing us that model.
Indeed, it's the largesse, stepping back on Chesterton, seeing the big picture, the nature of things, and at some point, committing to the truth. And you think of all the martyrs, there are more martyrs in the last century than there are the previous 19 centuries of Christianity, Christian martyrs. And, people who, in unknown ways, unsung, we know many, which are very inspirational and motivational, like Father Chiswick, but just to have that kind of commitment and imagine that kind of freedom. I choose this and all that comes with it, including suffering and maybe even death.
But we do have the beauty of that is we have something beyond that. So no, again, we don't want to leave. No one is screaming to leave this life, except in certain cases, which are really sad and despairing. But for the most part, as my dad was dying, I just came to that conclusion, like, no matter how the quality of life may be declining, there's this fight for life to the end. Like, it's hard to let go of this world, like for everyone, even Christians. But if you know that someone is waiting on the other end and that you're going to fall into the arms of love, and we believe that, then we can do it. We can let go. We can do the hard thing, knowing that love is on the other end. Well, go ahead. Did you have another thought?
Well, as the Lord himself says, Jesus on the cross, into your hands I commend my spirit. At some point, I commend my spirit into your hands. I trust.
Not an easy task at all. Easier to say than to do, but it's something we're all called to. And well, I feel like we could continue with these quotes, and actually there are more that I want to throw out, and you might have some, but I do want to take a little pause, and after the pause, I want to share a little from G.K. Chesterton himself. So stay here, and we'll get to that voice, because there's a little video that I want to share. All right, we'll be right back.
Get 3 months of local news for just 99 cents a month. You'll get unlimited access to the news you need to stay engaged and connected to your community. Visit inforum.com/subscribe now to get 3 months of local news for only 99 cents a month.
Welcome back to Matters of Soul Importance. We are talking with Mike Hagstrom about G.K. Chesterton, an English man who has brought much illumination of the faith and of life, and I thought it would be fun to hear his actual voice, and there are a few recordings out there, so I'm going to just play one that's on YouTube. I don't exactly know what year this is from, but it is G.K. Chesterton, so you'll get a little splice of his voice here.
But while I should resist the suggestion that we must eat beef without mustard, I do recognize that there is now a more subtle danger, that men may want to eat mustard without beef. I mean that they may lose their appetite for beef and bread and cheese, and depend entirely on spices and condiments. I myself have even been blamed for defending the spices of life against what was called the simple life. I have been blamed for making myself a champion of beer and Skittles. Fortunately, if I was a champion of Skittles, there was never any danger of my being a champion at Skittles. Somehow I never could aim at Skittles with that precision with which I could aim at beer. But I have played ordinary games like Skittles, always badly. I have even played golf in Scotland before Arthur Balfour brought it to England, and it became a fashion, and then a religion.
Well, there we go. What is he going on about, Mike? we got mustard, we've got beef, we've got Skittles.
Skittles is a sport, an English little game sport, so that's what he's talking
named
about.
Skittles, so
there.
I'm like,
Yeah, it's like a bowling game type of game in played in pubs and public houses, etc. in England. So. And
it might be kind of hard. That's an old recording, and there's kind of crackling going on. It was probably on the radio, and so it's a little bit hard to catch it. But if you could sum up what he just said, Mike, what do you think?
Well, he's speaking about the spice of life and how important they are, and that it would not, the point is not the spice itself, but how it adds zest to the ordinary things of life and the staples of life, shall we say. So just a metaphor for an approach to life, the importance of the spices, the things that add spice, while not neglecting, or it's kind of ironic of, we'll do without the hamburger or the beef and just have the mustard. Well, that's not going to satisfy.
Right.
Either, but just the right amount of mustard is perfect.
Yeah. We need the meat, though, at the bottom of it all, like to form the base. So, yeah. And of course, what I love, too, about that is his self-deprecating humor. Like he is very honest about who he is as a human being. He just throws it out there. Like if people want to attack him, that's fine, but he'll rather attack himself first. So
he could talk about his pockets and how, even Francis will find things, and probably after his death, they'll discover things of unfathomable, would have imagined would be found in his pockets. He starts emptying them, and it's inexhaustible.
Oh, funny. I can't imagine being married to the character, but
I would say a saint. Francis eventually converted to Catholicism too. Francis played a part in his embracing Christianity more from the start. I think he'd been baptized Anglican.
Okay.
But his father, his home was a Unitarian home, very, very, and I hate using the word liberal, conservative in terms of religion, but it was, a very open, we'll say, kind of amorphous type of approach to the faith, so Unitarian approach. And Francis was instrumental in getting him, practicing as an Anglican, more involved as an Anglican. Eventually, Chesterton becomes Catholic, and Francis likewise later. And today they're buried in a Catholic cemetery in England.
And they had children, right?
No.
Oh, they didn't? Okay,
no.
I was thinking, okay.
All of us.
Okay, yeah.
Our children and grandchildren benefiting from his wealth of wisdom. And yes, without Francis, boy, I don't know what his life would have been like.
I'm just curious, do you know how they met or anything like that? Or
I do not.
Okay, yeah. That'd be interesting to dig into her, because they say every saint has, a spiritual director or a spouse, or, a lot of times, like even Saint Therese, her parents now are canonized as well. So we all are in community and relationship to one another, and very rarely, if ever, acting on our own. So interesting to kind of look also at the characters surrounding him.
One of my favorite books, and I don't have it with me here, with my others on the table, the stack of books, but it's a book called Brave New Family, which is a collection of essays, proverbs, insights about marriage and family life, about male and female, and Chesterton, I think, embraced he called topsy-turvydom. I mean, just a view of the world where two different approaches. One is totally upside down and exact opposite, but he loved the traditional family, marriage, to the Garden of Eden, and great defense of what's at stake with the child, with the parents, mother and father, and family life and marriage. And he was such a prophet. He saw all these things in the early 1900s, early 20th century. He saw what was coming. He warned against them. He fought in defense of he would call tradition, which is the democracy of the dead, that even our ancestors have a vote and aren't at the mercy of the autocracy, the oligarchy of those who happen to be walking around right now, that small little portion of humanity, as opposed to tradition through the centuries and across all civilizations and cultures.
You mean it's not just us right now that rules everything? Yeah. That's an important thing, I think, right now in our world, where we kind of we're so. Well, here's what God is in the present, right? We know God is in the present. That's a good thought, but I think sometimes culturally, or even generationally, we think we're it. We don't look back, and we're not looking forward. We're just living in the now in a negative way, where we're not living for anything else, and we're not drawing from the past, and we're not thinking of the future, and that's dangerous. So,
he and Francis did not have children, but he just so loved children, and he was very childlike himself,
right?
And praised children and new life and the next generation. That's why he was so strongly in some of his historical writings on the saints, focusing on, for example, St. Thomas Aquinas, and against the kind of the Manichaean spirit, theological term there, but those who, there's a God who's a God of good and a God of evil, and the God of evil created the material world. And, to look on the body, the human body, and sexuality, and children, repugnant. There's that kind of temptation to heresy throughout the centuries of a dismissal. But if you do that, you don't last. There's not a next generation. So different religious groups throughout the centuries that embrace that approach don't last.
Right.
They don't. But St. Dominic founded the Dominicans, St. Thomas Aquinas, and others to attack or defend or teach the truth about the goodness of creation, the Creator, and how to live in this world.
Yeah. Well, I'd like to kind of get personal, Mike, and ask you a little bit about how G.K. Chesterton has helped you in your life as an educator and a dad and a grandfather. I don't know if you've been able to pinpoint some of those influences he's had on you. I know you were a person, and we can see that today, of great wit. I don't know if that's something you just are gifted with, and maybe just something you appreciate about Chesterton, but how has he kind of crossed your path in your journey of life?
I just mentioned marriage and family. He's been so influential in affirming, the wisdom of the church's teaching on marriage and family and sexuality. So that certainly is one thing. And as a father, as a grandfather, as a husband, I greatly appreciate those influences. I came to these things and read and studied and searched, partly because I am a teacher at heart. I taught for 31 years at Shanley. I'm in my 8th year now as the president of our school system. But I love his approach to the classroom as well. He himself never attended university. He's basically self-taught or taught in the home. He attended art college for a time, but he's an amazing genius. But maybe he was blessed not to be, to have the love of learning and a desire to seek the truth taught out of him. In so many classrooms, maybe we're so overly formal and we dissect everything, we analyze to death, rather than delight and joy in seeking the truth. So in my classroom, I certainly try to have that Chestertonian spirit of wonder, of joy, of asking questions, of seeking the truth, of doing this in dialogue, to have that kind of spirit in my conversations and with my students. So I certainly had that approach as well. Yes, I love his wit. I always been kind of a smart aleck, and I can be quick on my feet, but I do admire that about him as well. But more importantly, just it is the content. It is his wisdom that he's sharing in so many ways, whether it's proverbial wisdom or a long argued essay or a detective story, a poem. It's just that wisdom of the way of the world, of the relishing of reality. I just keep coming back to that. I so admire.
Yeah, it's he gives you things to think about. I can't imagine anyone from any side of whatever faction not being given a gift in some of the things he has shared. So that was one of the things. Just the way the paradoxes, the way he turned things on their head, it just makes you stop and think a little bit and grapple with that a little bit. And he did that. And I wonder if it was because he didn't allow himself to be confined. And there must have been a spirit of, generosity in that way, in the way he was grown up, that he could own that and trust in his own knowledge and his own seeking. So there was kind of a freedom there, I think, in that, like he wasn't bound in a way.
And it's not paradox for the sake of paradox. It's paradox to make a point.
Right.
It's wit for the sense of, to be wed to wisdom, to make, the case for wisdom. So I love that both and about Chesterton. And that's a whole other area is just he has that kind of approach of both and. It's a very Catholic approach to life. It's not an either or. What do you mean you fast and you don't eat food and you abstain? And what do you mean you feast and you celebrate? Which one is it? And we say, yes.
Yes.
It's both. It's both and. It's faith and reason.
Yeah.
When he talked about heresies, the truth stands at a 90-degree angle and it's able to stand. But if you undermine either way, you undermine that's what's at stake. Is a perception of an understanding of reality, then you fall. It's only at 90 degrees that you can stand. And so if you undermine aspects of the faith, that's why councils were called. That's why the great saints and defended the faith and taught the faith in order to preserve truth, to preserve reality.
And a big one being body and soul, not one or the other, right? That was a lot of the heresies come from that. And we still see some of those popping up.
Absolutely. Whether it's just a spiritualism, divorce from matter, from the body, from the real world. And, it's I will this. It's, the will to power. I will it all. Whatever I want, I will do and get. Or just the body or matter alone is the only reality, and I'm just a bunch of, atoms and chemicals, kind of a sack and a bag of moving chemicals and electrons. When I die, that's okay.
And to that, I come back to the basic, can't have something from nothing. I'll just put that out there because I don't know how something can happen from nothing, but I don't know. I'm just using logic there.
Well, the Hebrews have a word for that. The verb is bereh, I believe, which means to create out of nothing, which shocked other cultures. What do you mean? All other cultures talking about origin and creation, mythology, creation stories, assume a pre-existing world and pre-existing materials. The Jews, the Hebrews, were mocked for introducing that to create out of nothing. And what's the gap between something and nothing? Infinity, which implies an infinite, all-powerful God. So even in that approach, that simple statement, can is something from nothing. Well, there's quite a philosophy there, Roxanne. Quite a religion there, Roxanne.
Okay. I'm not off the hook
the
from
world,
just throwing that
Chesterton, speaking of, Chesterton said the world owes God to the Jews. They gave us this conception of creation and the creator.
Right. Tell me a little about this Chesterton Society, because I had been invited into it years ago when my kids were all little, and now just recently I've gone to a couple meetings, but I'm a newbie, so I don't know the origins. I don't know a lot about what you all have talked about through the years, some of your favorite speakers, or what you do. So
Well,
share
there
a
are
little
multiple
about that.
layers here. You could go, there's an international Chesterton Society, there's an American Chesterton Society. There are two Fargo-Moorhead Chesterton Societies, which grew up independently, believe it or not. But the one that I've been involved with started in the early 1990s. A speaker had been brought in, Dr. Oz Guinness, a social critic and philosopher, theologian, up in Grand Forks. And after the presentation by Dr. Guinness, our mutual friend Howard Dahl got a bunch of people together for a meal with Dr. Guinness. And they were people of different faith backgrounds and maybe no faith background as well, but just had a delightful conversation from their different faith traditions, their various experiences in life, whether business or a teacher, professor, member of the clergy, etc. They just had this phenomenal conversation and wanted to keep that going. Again, this is the early 1990s, maybe 91, 92. And then they thought, well, let's keep this going. Let's meet. So they started meeting on occasion and met for maybe about a year when they were talking, well, what should we call ourselves? What should be the name of our group? And one of the members when he was at UND was a member of, he had started something called the Friends of Aristotle.
Okay.
So they were talking about names and nothing really stuck. But one member suggested, I think Chesterton is someone that we can all, and we're talking, Lutheran, evangelical, Catholic, Orthodox, atheist. We could all embrace Chesterton, and so let's call ourselves a Chesterton Society. This is now maybe 92 or 93, someone in there. I was not at that original meeting, but shortly after that I saw a sign for a meeting out at Cardinal Mensch Seminary. It said Chesterton Society meeting on Saturday. I thought, what? Here's one of my heroes, Chesterton. I'd been reading more and more of him as I was teaching in the Catholic high school. And there's a Chesterton Society in Fargo-Moorhead here. So I talked to Father James Ermer. He said, talk to Justin Gullickson, who is one of the founding members and now dear friend of Justin's. But he said, yeah, come to our meeting. And we have met regularly over the years. Some years meeting more often than others. Sometimes for breakfast, sometimes for a luncheon. We might have a guest speaker come in, or various members would share. One of the big tasks early on was to take the book Orthodoxy. Each of us took a chapter and would present to the rest of the group and say, here's my take on this, and invite conversation and dialogue. That was we spent a whole year, chapter by chapter, reading through his classic book, Orthodoxy, various other things as well. Our mutual friend Tim Murphy of Happy Memory found out about the Chesterton Society. He would comment, those are some of my favorite meetings, Tim reading his poetry to us. So he became a member of the Chesterton Society. We still meet on occasion, and people have come and gone, some have passed away, but just this like-minded people who have this desire to know and to learn and to seek very intentionally. It's an ecumenical group, and we've had, like I said, atheist members as well. But just people want to be a part of something like that and explore and dialogue and discuss goodness, beauty, and truth in the spirit of G.K. Chesterton. I always say it's a group at the intersection of faith and reason. Mm-hmm. We come to discuss and talk and share and to learn from each other and to appreciate one another.
And talk in a respectful, thoughtful way where people aren't throwing arrows at each other or anything like that. That's so valuable, and I think we need to practice that too. It's something that needs to be practiced in community, right? And so that you're kind of prepared when you go out into the world. So,
and then there's the American Chesterton Society, as I understand it, was born in 1996. Dale Ahlquist from the Twin Cities, who has visited our local group several times, he's come up and presented. Dale Ahlquist formed the American Chesterton Society, and that's really a go-to website. I think it's ChestertonSociety.org, and they've got everything about Chesterton, his works, his biography, his impact. You mentioned before, they're promoting a cause for exploring sainthood, potential canonization, and the local bishop has to do that, and the Bishop of Northampton had declared that at this time we were not going to proceed with the cause, and gave some reasons, but Dale has a very good reply to him, and they've distributed prayer cards. You can go look, you can sign up, you can pray the prayer for the cause of G.K. Chesterton. You can ask for his prayers. That is a phenomenal website, and what a source. And they have an annual conference. I've attended a number of times in the summer, the G.K. Chesterton Conference, and sometimes held in the Twin Cities. I think now it moves around the country, but they are a phenomenal resource in keeping the spirit of Chesterton alive and telling the story of why this person should be known even more, even better than he is. And, some of these quotations you maybe didn't realize came from Chesterton himself. So shedding a lot of light.
Yeah.
On
I think Dale Ahlquist was the one I was quoting earlier, because it was that website that I was getting that from, the one that said he was the best thinker and writer in the 20th century. So yeah, he was born, Chesterton, in another time and place, but not that far from us. But why do you think what he had to say in the 1900s is important to us today in 2024? It was interesting because you were saying earlier that he really believed in not isolating ourselves to a generation, and that all the people that had come before us were part of who we are, and now I'm thinking he's part of who we are. We can continue to learn from him. But what do you think is the most analogous aspect of him right now that he can be our teacher? I think you've kind of hinted at it already, but what is your response directly to that?
I can't remember who said, but literature is news that remains news. Maybe that was C.S. Lewis, but just you read the daily paper and much of it can be discarded, but true literature, that's the distinction. And much of Chesterton's journalism, I would argue, is literature because it remains news. And he's really thinking things through and trying to capture. Yes, many of things are dated or analogies or references you've got to look up. But apart from that, there's such, again, because he's seeking the truth, and the truth is perennial.
Right,
the truth is, C.S. Lewis in Abolition of Man just showed across all culture there are core truths that almost every civilization has embraced, and these basic core things. He called it you can call it the Tao or the way, but there's a perennial truth. And Chesterton certainly engaged with that. And that's why we still can read him today to great profit, because he embraced that perennial philosophy. He embraced the truth, capital T.
Yeah. I've heard it put this way, and I think some people might scratch their heads, but reality preceded the church. Reality preceded the church. Like, reality was there before the church was. It's always been. The church came later. What do you think about that?
Well, yeah, I was thinking on the other hand, and Chesterton has these phrases, makes you think of, the church is not in the world. That's not the end of the sentence, but the church is not in the world. Mm-hmm. The world is in the church. And so he's speaking almost like a St. Paul in Ephesians or Colossians, and talking about the height and breadth and, the width of Christ himself, who the creator of all things that were made were created in and through him. So he's even bigger.
Right.
So I'm thinking that when I hear you say that.
Like supernaturally, yes, like the church is beyond this world and also, but the church as we know it, like the visible body of church is came after reality. And it's based on reality.
And how about Thomas Aquinas, grace built on nature?
Right,
so,
right. Yes, yeah.
Right.
If someone were to dive in and maybe they've never heard of him, maybe they just haven't read any of his works, where would you suggest they start?
Well, a good place might be Dale Ahlquist's summaries. There are things about Chesterton, the Apostle of Common Sense, is a nice little introductory paragraph. Common Sense 101 lessons. There are numerous books of his quotations, if you like that. Ignatius Press has done a great service in publishing the collected works of G.K. Chesterton. That's part of the reason why Ignatius Press was founded in San Francisco by Father Fessio. And in addition to publishing the works of von Balthasar, his theology. So there were these great authors that weren't in print. And so Ignatius Press, you can explore, the broad collections of his work. Orthodoxy, I think, is a masterpiece. I just asked my friend Justin this morning, what is your favorite Chesterton book? He loves the book on St. Thomas Aquinas, of which, I think Etienne Gilson, the great Thomistic scholar, says Chesterton leads me to despair. I studied Thomas all my life, and I couldn't write anything this beautiful, this good, a short little work that captures St. Thomas Aquinas so well. That would be a detective story. Just start small. The stories of Father Brown. Listen to these titles. Do these sound interesting? Just the titles. The Purple Wig. The Hammer of God. That's my favorite.
Yeah.
The Absence of Mr. Glass. The Mistake in the Machine. The Song of the Flying Fish. Just those titles of the detective stories.
He paints a picture.
He does.
Yeah.
And Father Brown is modeled on, a priest that influenced him, that knew the human heart and looked at, and read the human heart and really studied and observed, the details of what was going on, a kind of a Catholic Sherlock Holmes, if you will. So Father Brown, you start there. The poetry, lovely poems. I never let Christmas pass without looking at some of his Christmas poems, one of which is entitled The House of Christmas, ends this way. To an open house in the evening, home shall men come, to an older place than Eden, and a taller town than Rome, to the end of the way of the wandering star, to the things that cannot be and that are, to the place where God was homeless, and all men are at home. The House of Christmas. That's just the last little stanza. I always read that at Christmas time to remind me of the incarnation of God who was homeless and but then became man.
Yeah. Wow.
And now we're all at home because God became.
So much there. Well, Mike, if you could put it in, I always do this at the end, and I know it throws people. If you could just, in a nutshell, who was G.K. Chesterton? I think we've definitely shared what that is in great length, but is there a way to encapsulate the man?
Well, I would say, just talking about his, he's a mystery that moved mountains culturally, theologically, philosophically, journalistically. He's a mountain of a man. He moved mountains. He's a mountain of a man who, ultimately a mystery, who moved mountains. He really, really, like earthquakes that still reverberate through the decades. Quite an impact, quite an influence, quite a...
Worth getting to know. And by the way, politics and religion, there's nothing else to talk about, right? Well, thank you so much, Mike, for being with us today. I really, really appreciate this. You have a great knowledge of this man and a love for him, and that shines through. And I hope that this will drive a lot of listeners out there to go find some of G.K. Chesterton and invite them into their lives.
Yep, don't take my word for it. Read Chesterton.
Absolutely. Well, God bless you.
Thank you, Roxanne.
Was G.K. Chesterton. Today we offered a rather rounded out view of this man. No pun intended. Well, sort of. But seriously, I hope that if you've never heard of Chesterton before, you are now intrigued at the introduction, and that if you had heard of him, you are delighted to have been reminded of him. Truly, his genius comes out in his quotes, and I thought I'd conclude our time together today with a couple of my favorites that didn't make it into the interview, while once again inviting you to explore more of this brilliant man, so robust in form and in faith. He once said, Jesus promised his disciples 3 things: that they would be completely fearless, absurdly happy, and in constant trouble. I know a little bit about that. He also said, and I love this, God is like the sun. You cannot look at it, but without it, you cannot look at anything else. I'll return in a couple weeks when I ask lay Lutheran pastor Raleigh Johnson, an outdoor enthusiast, what does God's voice sound like? Until then, don't lose sight of the light.